Hey Tim.
Hey man, I love that astronaut depiction of yourself.
Isn't that
That's
fun? Yeah.
nice.
Mark Zuckerberg has just given us all free access on Meta, his AI or the Llama, whatever it's called, to make infinite AI selfies. So,
How
are you feeling
generous.
better? How you doing?
Yeah, better, definitely. I'm still on the mend.
Was it the flu or what?
Yeah, I assume so. I mean, no official diagnosis, but influenza A has been going around, and everyone at my daughter's daycare, kids and adults, have been hammered by it. So, that seems the likely culprit in our case as well. My wife is still pretty unwell. She wasn't hit quite as hard as me, but she's still got a really bad cough. And I'm still a bit run down, but way better than I was. Yeah.
Glad to hear it.
How are you doing?
Doing well, yeah, staying busy, giving a lot of talks. My summer break, quote unquote, is winding to a close here, but yeah, a lot of interesting conversations recently with folks talking about Rudolf Steiner
Mm.
a lot recently. But yeah, also trying to keep up with the fast pace of the developments in the field of psychedelic studies, which will be our topic for today. Um, there was a very surprising decision by the FDA last week, I guess, or over the weekend, denying MAPS or the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, Lycos, the ability to administer MDMA for PTSD.
Hmm.
The data seem to be pretty good for treatments of PTSD, which is notoriously treatment resistant. I mean, there are some things that make a dent, but this was just blowing other treatments out of the water, so it seemed. But um, there are so many confounding factors in uh, the study of psychedelics and in the attempt to medicalize them. It seems that the FDA was not well positioned to evaluate the therapeutic component. Um, and also, there was some activist resistance to this particular, at least, medicalization pathway. Uh, and so, now I think a lot of people in this fields are scrambling to figure out what comes next. You guys over there in Australia are moving ahead. It seems slowly and carefully, but nonetheless, it's been legalized for medical use. Is that right?
Yeah. So, we have a particular poisons schedule here, similar to the scheduling that you have in the US, although it's the opposite in the sense that, your most highly controlled restricted substances are, notoriously Schedule 1 in the US, whereas ours are Schedule 10. So it's the opposite. And MDMA and psilocybin for treatment-resistant PTSD and treatment-resistant depression, respectively, have been shifted from basically from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8. So from essentially a prohibited schedule to a schedule where they are, controlled, prescription only substances, and what's been introduced here is a so-called authorized prescriber scheme. So the way the TGA, which is the Therapeutic Goods Administration, regulates drugs in Australia and classifies them according to the poison schedule is, it's somewhat complex. Every country has their, own sort of elaborate system of regulations, and often the TGA proceeds by approving specific products for specific uses. Um, and then, we have a whole other challenge or, set of guidelines or restrictions surrounding off-label uses of things as well. So like ketamine, for example, is also Schedule 8, but it's Schedule 8 because of its use as an anesthetic. And so, its use in, say, psychedelic therapy, it would be an off-label usage and currently an unapproved. So research, you can get research approval for that kind of thing, and there has been active ketamine research in Australia for quite a while, but it can't be prescribed. MDMA and psilocybin have kind of jumped the queue in a certain sense because they were completely prohibited, unlike ketamine. They've jumped into this category where they can be used in accordance with this authorized prescriber scheme, but there are no actual approved products. So there's a proviso for the use of unapproved products. There are sourcing guidelines for these things. And then, there's this authorized prescriber scheme where basically anyone who wants to prescribe MDMA, there's a checklist, that you need to go through, and it starts with things like, relevant, psychiatric qualifications, as one would expect, and one needs to submit a treatment guideline, a treatment plan to a human ethics council, get approval from them, and then submit to the TGA, to the Therapeutic Goods Administration, with that approval in hand for a second approval, to become an authorized prescriber. And
so let me ask you just two questions on this. First was this shift in the scheduling of MDMA and psilocybin based on research that had been done or clinical trials? Yeah, okay.
Well, it's based on the clinical trials not that have been done. There are ongoing clinical trials in Australia, but it's not based on Australian research. It's based on the same international research that has
including maybe some MAPS papers that have since been retracted in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, quite possibly. Certainly, for psilocybin, the paper that the TGA links is the New England Journal of Medicine one.
On for MDMA, maybe.
Yeah.
And also, the other question was just, do you know how many people have been treated in Australia with these shifts? Is it a small number, or
it'll be a small number. I don't have details, and I don't know how many authorized prescribers exist. So the first treatments were given in January of this year, the first treatment, I believe, of MDMA. And I gather that there were some, like early this year, there were up to 10 authorized prescribers, either had been approved or pending approval. But this this information, so far as I can tell, isn't sort of widely publicly available. Like there isn't a public directory of authorized prescribers. People who wish to seek this kind of treatment are advised to speak to their GP and go through the usual pipelines. But I guess it's important to note that the approvals are very specific. So it's not that, these drugs are now legal for prescription or for any given use, right? They're only legal. So the TGA regulates drugs according to very specific usages. So as I said, ketamine, you can use that as an anesthetic, and it's widely used as an anesthetic as everywhere in the world. It's a WHO essential medicine as an anesthetic, ketamine, but very, very tightly restricted. It's different in America, right? In America, you can do off-label usages way more easily. That's why ketamine therapy is like a thing in the US. But here, that is very strictly prohibited. So MDMA can only be used for treatment-resistant PTSD. So even if you had and similarly with psilocybin, treatment-resistant depression. So even if you had a diagnosis of PTSD or depression, that doesn't mean you'd be eligible for, treatment with.
It's not the first thing they're going to try. Yeah.
Exactly. So not only does an authorized prescriber have to go through, a considerable amount of rigmarole in order to gain that classification to be able to use MDMA or psilocybin in their practice. And by the way, it does mention the necessary provision of psychotherapy in the TGA guidelines. So that's a good thing. Well, I think we're going to discuss that, but I would suggest that's a good thing, with its own specific set of risks. Patients will have had to have been through you know, SSRIs, various forms of psychotherapy, etc. So they will need to be in the system in some fairly deep way. And that might be one of the justifications. At least I am not aware of any kind of, I've searched for a public directory. I don't think there's a public directory of authorized prescribers at this stage. And I think that's just partly because, yeah, you're already going to be very involved in a process of treatment for this kind of thing to be legally available to you.
Right. So that's the legal and medical side
Yeah.
of it in the situation, at least in the US and Australia. I'm not sure if there are any other countries where MDMA or psilocybin are currently medically accessible, whether on label or off label, besides Australia. Do you know?
Well, certainly there are, the Netherlands is obviously an interesting case. And I'm not fully across regulations there, but, you know, psilocybin is still legal through truffles. You know, they have a funny ruling
Right.
there. Mushrooms are illegal now. I mean, they were legal for a long time. Mushrooms are illegal, but the sclerotia of a psilocybin producing mushroom species of a psilocybe of some description, or maybe Panaeolus or whatever, is legal. So there's like a weird anatomical distinction between different parts of the fungus.
We have that in the US now with a hemp law that Congress passed without realizing what it was doing,
Oh
where
yeah.
a small amount of THC is allowed, but if you
Oh yeah.
refine it, if you just grow hemp and then, you know,
Yeah.
refine it to get a higher THC content in the product you produce, that's legal and it's not regulated by the
Oh,
DEA under Schedule 1. So it's a whole, it's
right.
upending the cannabis industry, which in some states is legal, but hemp
Yeah.
is legal in every state now. So,
Hemp
um,
has been legal here for forever. Isn't it? You know, hemp is very legal in Australia.
mm,
So you can buy, you've been able to buy hemp seeds at the supermarket and hemp oil
right.
and hemp clothing has been a big thing here for a long time, and that's regulated based on, yes, basically the THC content of the plant. So whether it's classified as hemp or cannabis, which is, still heavily, well, we have legal medical cannabis in Australia federally, nationally, but yeah, and that's been very, very accessible here in a very sudden. I mean, again, through an authorized prescriber scheme, but much less tightly controlled than psychedelics. And there is some sense that they may be now trying to increase control and make it more difficult for cannabis to be prescribed here. But that's sort of an open thing. You asked about whether these things were based on research. I mean, for sure, they're based on research in the sense that we know this research exists, but they're based on campaigning. It's based on PR in a huge way, and that's part of the reason why we get these fairly weird sudden shifts in policy where it's kind of clear that they don't have, like, when psychedelics, again, MDMA,
Mhm.
whatever, impactogen, empathogen, we can talk about the pharmacology, obviously, but
I
MDMA and
believe in
some,
a heart mind, and MDMA is heart mind and manifesting, so we'll
sure,
classify it
yeah.
as psychedelic.
Um, anyway, when those two substances were shifted, were rescheduled, there was no authorized. It took 6 months or more for anyone to be approved as an authorized prescriber, and the initial sense was that the TGA wasn't, like, there wasn't any clear pathway to becoming an authorized prescriber, but that also changed fairly quickly, like quickly enough for people to be receiving treatment early this year. So basically, it was June last year that the scheduling changed. And with medical cannabis, there was also this sense that there was a lot of resistance to its legalization, but then there was a big public outcry. We need this drug for kids with epilepsy, for people with chronic pain, for people who are suffering, side effects from chemotherapy, et cetera, et cetera. There was a big public outcry, lots of newspaper articles and all that. And then the TGA kind of, I don't know if it's the right way of saying it, but they roll over a little bit in response to this public. So there had
Yeah.
been this whole committee and someone from my university, a professor emeritus in my department, actually, was the head of the advisory council for medical cannabis to the Australian government, and there was a fairly conservative approach, I think, being taken by the pharmacologists who were involved, and things like cannabis. Cannabis, strictly speaking, is not a drug, right? Cannabis is a plant, and it produces all of these different metabolites, and obviously some of them are psychoactive, and of course, notably THC. But it's a bit of a nightmare for a classic pharmacologist who has this idea of, a single substance, a single drug that ideally has very, very specific effects, interacts with very specific targets in the body, and et cetera, et cetera. We should get into this because there's this discussion to be had, and I think related to the paper you were just sharing with me about, like, how much knowledge do we need to have before we can approve things, or what is the role of kind of mechanistic, pharmacological, or neurocognitive, or whatever knowledge in this space. But my feeling was that there was a lot of conservative, and even concern. Again, there was recognition that there was some therapeutic benefit here, but how are we going to regulate this? It's so complex because it's this complex plant product. And then in the end, this public swell of opinion, like, as it became a possibility, and there were, became public knowledge that there were committees discussing this sort of thing, and then the public outcry grew and grew, and that may have been the thing that really pushed the regulation across the line. And I think that that's a kind of a similar thing. There's an organization here called Mind Medicine Australia.
I've heard of it.
They sort of have taken a lot of credit. I don't know how true that is, but I mean, again, there's been a sustained, campaign for, as in the US, as in many places, sort of a PR campaign for the legalization of these substances, and Mind Medicine has had some role in that, and ultimately that's what gets the regulation across the line, it seems, anyway.
Yeah, it's not that different in the US. I mean, the FDA is notorious for being this revolving door of consisting of a revolving door of career politicians and corporate executives from big pharma. And so to what extent it's regulating the industry or being regulated by the industry is sort of, a disputed point. But it seems like in this case, over the summer before the FDA made its official decision on this phase 3 trial that MAPS and Lycos had been seemingly on paper quite successful with, there was a public committee hearing, and mostly sort of left-wing Marxist critical psychedelic activists were going after MAPS and really trying to say there's lots of unethical fudging of the numbers going on. And, there was a very, at this point, well-known case of a therapist involved in sexual misconduct with a trial participant. We're talking, as far as I know, there's one example of that in about 200, different participants in the phase 3 trial. So these activists put public pressure on the FDA and seemingly swayed their decision based on factors that weren't actually being evaluated. The FDA is looking at a certain set of data based on a study design that they helped Lycos, with, and somehow other factors became relevant because of public pressure, I think. And so on the one hand, it's such an interesting example of the interplay between democracy and science, and how we make decisions about medicine and try to disentangle that from the various cultural reasons that lead to certain drugs or plants to be, or fungi to be made illegal at certain times in history, when the medical science doesn't actually support that. But on the other hand, even if there's no medical application, say for cannabis or psilocybin or MDMA or LSD, maybe in a democracy, we should want adults, responsible adults, to be able to engage in the alteration of their consciousness when there is enough evidence to say they're at least far less physiologically harmful or toxic in comparison to many other substances that are perfectly legal,
Yeah.
and that kill a lot of people every year, like alcohol and tobacco, and and
Opioid.
so and opioids, yeah. So the whole question of the medicalization of psychedelics has always been one that of I have mixed opinions, because mixed
Mm.
feelings about it, because on the one hand, there's a sector of society, like veterans, for example, who might not have access to these things in a safe way outside the context of a clinic through the VA health system. And while I have some questions about Lycos and a lot of questions, I mean, I know Rick Doblin, and he's a really nice man who's brilliant in what he's been able to accomplish, but also I think got a little carried away in talking about the PR campaign, at least that he started to inflate. Um,
Net
he
zero
got
trauma.
net zero trauma and mass mental health, and we're going to cure war. We're going to bring about some sort of spiritual utopia and so on. This is not the type of rhetoric
Yeah. If you
that's
don't want to appear as though you're a cult leader who has drunk the
yeah,
Kool-Aid, encouraging everyone else to drink the Kool-Aid, don't speak
yeah,
in that way. And if, I mean, Timothy Leary's role in the original scheduling of LSD and so I think is often overblown um, by certain critics. But I think there's like a lesson there. If you go around saying that take these substances and you'll see through the facade of our bullshit society, you can expect there to be some backlash from those who wish to maintain that facade. And I think that's one of the big questions. I mean, you were alluding to, why do some of these substances, which physiologically seem to be relatively non-toxic, why do they end up being so strongly regulated against? Why is there such stigma? And that's a big story, which we could definitely develop. That's a story that I try to tell in my lectures to pharmacology students here in the course of Drugs That Shape Society. And one of the key ways that I would frame that is, some substances seem to be more inherently disruptive for like state-based societies, themselves. There's this notion of disruptive pharmacology as opposed to drugs which perhaps are drugs of normalizing, drugs that help to maintain kind of quote unquote healthy normal subjects in some socio-psychological way rather than in a physiological way. Derrida actually has a great essay on this, the rhetoric of drugs, which he doesn't really talk about psychedelics, but that's something we could get into. But that's one issue that we can discuss. Another thing is I mean the Lycos situation, and it's unclear to me how much of an influence. I mean, we're talking about, we got onto the subject through the influence of activists. It's unclear to me how much of an influence the activists have had. So critical activists, especially, and, the calling out of the abuse, which, needed to be called out, obviously. How much of it, and certainly those activists appear to be ready to take credit and to celebrate the FDA decision as a win for victims. I've seen them saying, which is an interesting way of framing it. I mean, to me, that suggests, when you're in this very small community like the psychedelic community, and I think these people identify as being, broadly part of that community, and you recognize that there are structural inequalities in that community. And then you start seeing, MAPS, for example, as a kind of big brother type organization that needs to be taken down, but you're using a much bigger, structural inequality, like, the status quo of drug regulation and its relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, and it's difficulty in accommodating anything than an attempt to uphold the status quo, basically. When you style yourself as a revolutionary within a small community by appealing to the status quo of the larger community in which that small community is nested, there's a little bit of an issue there, I think. But it might be interesting also to talk about all the other reasons why the FDA and what the FDA has apparently themselves said, although we don't have access to the actual letter that they sent to Lycos, but what they've said to the people that they've given statements to, and also what Lycos has said that they've said, which all seem to be quite kind of expected challenges with this kind of therapeutic intervention. So aside from evidence of effectiveness, which I think is, seems to be there, there's the big, question of the like functional unblinding thing, right? And this has been a known issue. This is not a new thing. This is a known issue for any psychoactive medication. It's also a real issue to have placebos and a kind of double-blind structure when you have any psychotherapeutic intervention, because clearly those who are delivering the therapy then cannot be blinded. So you need, because they need to know what they're doing. And it may be obvious to participants as well if you were testing two different kinds of psychotherapeutic intervention in comparison, for example, or psychotherapy versus the absence of psychotherapy, it's going to be fairly obvious whether you're receiving psychotherapy or not, or if you have a little bit of knowledge and you can't prevent someone who's taking part. They're not like juries where they're sequestered away from the internet or whatever. You can't prevent them from seeking information about the psychotherapy that they might be receiving. So they might readily be able to make those kinds of comparisons. So blinding is always an issue. And placebo controls are an issue when there's any psychotherapeutic intervention. There's also this question of prior MDMA use, which was brought up. Like, do patients need to be, naive? So in a number of these areas, the concern is the role of expectancy, right? So some kind of positive expectancy, like, well, maybe if they're pre-users, they're already well disposed towards the substance, or maybe because they won't be blinded, because as soon as the thing starts coming on, they're going to realize, oh, I got the active dose. Like, it's hard to not know.
And that this research is going on in the midst of a highly popularized psychedelic renaissance. And when veterans are talking to their friends who also suffer from PTSD, there's a great deal of expectancy that builds up. And these are also people who are suffering with treatment-resistant PTSD. They're seeing results. They want to participate in these trials. And so the FDA knew about this, after the phase 2 trial, I think, then they helped redesign the phase 3 trial to try to account for this. But because of the powerful, consciousness altering effects of these substances, there's just no way to maintain blinding after 45 minutes. So it seems to me an issue that we need to attend to, but that there's no way to avoid in the study of psychedelic medicines that this.
Well, you'd have to do a study design, I think, where you were comparing two active treatments or something like that. So if you were comparing ketamine therapy to MDMA therapy or something, along those lines.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the question then is whether, of course, the idea is to compare an unapproved novel therapy with an approved treatment. Not necessarily we should never say to compare with an effective treatment, because it may be that the unapproved treatments are not particularly effective. That's why there is an unmet need.
But even the placebo group that just received therapy, right, still had a 20 to 30% rate of symptom reduction.
This is not unexpected, given that psychotherapy is one of the major interventions, indicated effective, or at least, approved and indicated, therapeutic interventions for PTSD. I mean, it's basically psychotherapy and SSRIs. That's basically the major treatment pathways for PTSD. So of course you expect there to be some effectiveness in a placebo group that is only receiving psychotherapy, because psychotherapy is one of the best things you can do for people with PTSD, right? And again, as we know, in this sort of psychedelic assisted therapeutic paradigm, the role of the psychedelic is to not to replace psychotherapy, is to augment and potentiate the effects of psychotherapy. So that's still based on a fundamental view that insight generating psychotherapy is, you know, the primary effective modality for treating the, and then it's just how does that interact with specific you know, pharmacotherapeutics that can augment it. And one of the issues with a kind of status quo model of psychiatry is that a lot of the pharmacological interventions appear to be used to replace rather than augment psychotherapy. And there are, again, there's a lot to discuss there, you know. One of the real challenges for practitioners with something like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is that, if anything, it's increasing the level of responsibility because of the risk of re-traumatization, because of the emotional volatility that comes up in these particular, you know, the kind of thing that you're trying to get through what would be described in a psychoanalytic circles as mechanisms of defense, right? So there are mechanisms of defense which make people more or less open, more or less susceptible to a psychotherapeutic intervention. And, you know, we've talked about Jung, you know, there are lots of different ways of speaking about the mechanisms of defense in a psychoanalytic context and how a psychotherapist should respond to them. And, you know, not necessarily riding roughshod over them and like dismantling them, but, you know, because these are very, you know, important. They are ways that this person who's suffering from PTSD or whatever it might be, has developed psychic defenses, has developed to protect themselves from something that is too intense for them to engage with directly under normal circumstances and remain functional. Like, that's the basic idea, right? And then the idea of psycholytic psychotherapy is that there is a loosening of the mechanisms of defense, psycholytic, a lysis of the psyche, so a cutting, essentially, of these mechanisms of defense to make someone more open. But that puts, and of course we see where this can lead to abuse, and we know that's happened, but that puts a greater onus on the practitioner, on the therapist, to be prepared to receive whatever is, you know, becomes available, whatever is released as a result of that, you know, loosening of the psyche. And that's quite the opposite from the sort of 1980s Prozac paradigm in psychiatry, where, you know, I definitely don't want to tar all psychiatrists with this brush or whatever, but as a kind of caricature of the, you know, will we diagnose you here, take these substances, and in your next consultation we'll work out whether your dose is correct. You know, we'll see how you're going with your symptoms, and the main discussion is going to be how are we titrating this dose in order to suppress your symptoms more effectively so that you can be adapted. This is why these drugs can start to look like drugs for maintaining the status quo. You can go to work, you can be a good, healthy, normal subject, because we're going to, you know, strengthen your mechanisms of defense. It's quite the opposite in a way. But the responsibility there, it becomes less on the psychiatrist and more on the drug itself. And then even more, in a way, on the FDA and their approval of that drug, you know, so it's safety, blah, 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 and on the pharmaceutical company which has made it and all of that. And the practitioner, the psychiatrist, can kind of abrogate responsibility to some more significant degree, which is totally the opposite with this psychedelic paradigm.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the issues here that you're helping me to articulate better that I have with the medicalization approach is that, you know, typically people relate to their doctors as the expert who knows how to maintain health. And in many cases, especially when we do get brought into the hospital setting because of some acute illness, we have no agency anymore. You know, we're asked if we're still of sound mind to go if we want to go through with this or that procedure. But for the most part, especially as soon as our consciousness is deemed to have gone offline, we're subject to whatever that system wants to do to us. And so similarly, when someone comes to a psychiatrist, um, let's say to do MDMA therapy, there can be this power differential and this expectation that you will heal me, or this this chemical will heal me. But something that MAPS really tried to foreground in their treatment manual was this idea of a non-directive approach in the so-called inner healer, the inner healing intelligence, which comes out of Stanislav Grof's psychedelic philosophy. Um,
And just
he,
psychoanalysis. I'll just say, that's a good psychoanalysis.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's studying Reich and Jung and yeah, all the way back. Um, but the idea here is to empower the participant, and they're called participants. They're not um, patients, because if healing is going to happen, it's because that participant is willing to meet these defenses, and with the expanded openness granted by the MDMA to yeah, confront and dissolve and reinterpret and come into a new relationship to memories and psychic tangles and complexes. And so this is though precisely where um, some of these critics like Nishay Devano, whose work I think is really important and I love a lot of it, but she zeroes in on this question of the inner healing intelligence as a um, part of what makes MAPS cultish for her. She called it a therapy cult, is because it has these transpersonal roots in an attempt to shift some of the agency and responsibility for healing onto the participant, and to not give the participant the impression that the therapist or the substance is going to do this for them. Although, granted, a lot of the marketing also does put the power into the chemical. Um, the therapists that I've spoke to all insist that it's not about the chemical. It's about the participant being empowered um, to leverage the openness provided by the chemical to seek their own healing. But so this transpersonal dimension of psychedelic experience and the way that therapists with a lot of um, practice and engaging with these states themselves and with participants, I think it's the real it's a crucial fulcrum, I think, for kind of ontological politics, really,
Mm.
because there's no place in contemporary medicine, really, or psychiatry, really, for this idea, unless you're a Jungian. But he was a physician, but I don't think many psychiatrists nowadays um, are practicing Jungians. Um, I'm sure there are a few out there, but for the most part, the FDA and the psychiatric establishment is thinking of psychedelic chemistry in the same way they think of any um, pharmacology, which is that we're trying to turn the dials of brain chemistry to get this person to be functional again. Um, and so the way I really find Nishay's work to be valuable and important is that the criticism of the individualized brain-based approach that medicalization of psychedelics tends towards, which backgrounds what she's really concerned about is that it backgrounds social inequalities, it backgrounds material conditions,
Mm.
um, and I would say it also backgrounds sort of the ecological entanglement and coevolutionary history that we have with these substances,
Yeah.
so that this isn't a brain-bound brain chemistry thing. It's also just about everything, all the substances that we eat and consume are altering our consciousness. So, take your pick. We don't have a choice in this matter um, about being altered by the substances that we partake in and that partake of us. And
We,
then
we're
they're all
we're not organizationally closed.
yeah, that's exactly right. And then there are also there's the social, the ecological, and then also the transpersonal dimensions here. And what's interesting about Shay Devano's article is that she's anti-materialism when it comes to the no brain-based solution to mental health problems. Uh, but then because I think she's basically coming from a more or less historical materialist Marxist point of view, she's very skeptical of any sort of spiritual overlay on this, it would seem. at least in her published work. And so that for me goes a little bit too far. I don't know that we can avoid um, the spiritual side of the psychedelic experience. And that might not be possible to contain in a medical context. Um, right. And so that's why I'm of mixed minds about this. And there's clearly a big push from the tech elites, from the people into transhumanism and effective altruism and long-termism and all these things to fund psychedelic research because they see it not only as a way of literally medicating people to be more comfortable with immiseration and becoming unemployed and pushed out of the economy by increasing automation. Uh, but they also see these psychedelics as a way of enhancing their own creativity, even if that means microdosing instead of, taking heroic doses that break down that ego that wants to continue to accumulate wealth and power. And so,
Exactly.
there are all these factors um, at play here that makes psychedelic studies so fun and so controversial. Um,
And why there's such a need for real psychedelic studies programs, uh,
Psychedelic
tertiary
humanities. Yeah.
psychedelic humanities for sure. And just transdisciplinary psychedelic studies, which incorporates perspectives from the humanities and from science, of course. Uh, yeah, look, there's heaps that you said there. I haven't read that whole Devono article that you sent me just 20 minutes before the chat, but it looks really interesting, and it certainly, like you, just from having had a glance and from what you've said about it, I would have sympathy with a lot of the things that she said, and I think that I say a lot of those things in the lecture series that I give at the major Australian university which I teach. But it does seem to me like there are also some structural inconsistencies in her in the perspective that she's taking, and I think you've articulated some of those. But you know, I fully agree. One of the things that I give a lecture on addiction and different approaches to addiction, and I do talk about a way of framing, which again, can be linked to a kind of Freudian notion of repetition compulsion, but a way of framing a lot of different mental health disorder as a form of addictive behavior, even if it's like cryptic internal behavior with compulsive thinking and re-traumatizing, continually revisiting a traumatic occurrence, which can of course just be an unconscious process in the sense of like re-traumatizing invasive dreams and things like that people with PTSD might suffer from. But there are lots of different ways of thinking about addiction, and one of the major ways, someone like Bruce Alexander with his study published in the book The Globalization of Addiction, but his famous rat park experiments, and looking at addiction much more as a consequence of social fragmentation and again, yes, structural inequalities in society, and not about either demon drugs that are just intrinsically addictive. Drugs are addictive. Certain drugs have a propensity for being addictive in certain sociocultural contexts, but not intrinsically. And of course, it's just nonsense to talk about drugs having any intrinsic properties of any kind. But yeah, I mean, when so I agree with all of that she's saying, that we don't want. It's also been a long conversation in the sort of psychoanalysis and the critical responses to psychoanalysis and psychiatry, the so-called anti-psychiatry movement, about is the role of psychotherapy to adapt someone to their sociocultural context, so that to resolve some kind of adaptive conflict that they're having by harmonizing them with their social, making them accept essentially that you might have all of these desires and drives which are inconsistent with the society in which you live, but really you just have to deal with that and bracket that and become a good, conformist subject. And that's one of the, that's the major criticism level from the anti-psychiatry movement. Or is the role of, again, a more Jungian perspective, but not exclusively, is the role of psychotherapy actually to help people individuate and discover themselves as singularities. And in the way that, Todd McGowan's recent book is called Embracing Alienation, is it in a sense, a way of helping people embrace the fact that they will always be, to the extent that they are individuals, in some kind of adaptive conflict, and that they shouldn't be seeking some kind of identity that they can conform to and all that sort of stuff, but embracing the fact that we're all alienated constantly. And that, in a sense, is that is a correlate with the idea of the inner healer. It's a different way of speaking about it, maybe, but that we have
less
this
cozy way.
Less cozy way of speaking about it, yeah, maybe. But yeah, we have this potential as individual, organisms in some ongoing process of creative development. And what's really required for some kind of healing to occur, although certain less cozy schools of thought would probably just reject the idea of healing altogether.
It's about becoming wounded in the right way, in a manageable way that allows you to speak through the wound as a gift, and being able to compassionately relate to others who are suffering.
But so whilst I agree with Devino's concerns that a brain-based model might put all the responsibility on the individual, and maybe the inner healer model makes it seem like it's this diseased individual needs to heal themselves, and we don't need to change any of the structural inequalities and the problems with society, which arguably, and I fully agree, lead to a lot of the mental health challenges that people have. So I agree with her there, but I think what is the what escape do we have from this kind of social, societal, the hegemony of norms and values that we receive from the sociocultural context into which we're born and in which we develop, other than an appeal to something like, and don't call it inner healer, I don't care about the terms. We in our other conversations, whether we're talking about Jung and the paraclete, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, whether we're talking about Simondon and the pre-individual, we're talking about, I don't know, Schelling and the unpre-thinged, or the unconditioned, and all, like, without appeal to that kind of ontology, that kind of creative ontology, which, whether it needs to be spiritualized or not, that can be a personal preference. I think this is this is the kind of ontology that I'm interested in when we're having discussions of the free energy principle and things like that. It's not
just so you have skin in the game. She also goes after evolutionary types of narratives too, not just the spiritual ones, especially the spiritualized evolutionary ones. But
for sure, that's the worst combination, right? and I kind of agree with her to some,
sure.
Like there's a community, or there's a way of thinking that I identify with, but I certainly don't identify with the mainstream, obviously, ways of thinking in terms of evolutionary thought. There are lots of
Pierre de Chardin gets co-opted by Ray Kurzweil and this very technocentric transhumanist orientation in a way that I think is totally contrary to what's at the heart of his vision. There's superficial similarities that they take certain parts of his vision. So I agree with a lot of her criticisms too of this. It's an elitism at the end of the day.
But so how do we escape that kind of elitism, that kind of, again, hegemony of received norms and the status quo? How do we move in a more egalitarian direction? What is moving in a more egalitarian direction about? It's partly about increasing the degrees of freedom of individuals so that they can be more self-determining. Well, what is the inner healer model about? Again, don't call it that. I don't care what you call it. What is that about? It's about finding a way of discovering and increasing those degrees of freedom, which enable the individual subject. But even there's a critique of subjectivity here. There's a critique of the sovereign subject if we push this far enough, because, this kind of, hegemonic hierarchical power structure, well, we know about the similarities, the influence between, like, I don't know, structuralist anthropology and psychoanalysis, for example. There's a structure of the psyche with the ego as sort of presiding over all of the lesser complexes, and suppressing or repressing them in some way, which is mirrored in the form of the state, blah, blah, blah. But how do we, again, there seems to be a tension in her view, because one way of increasing the degrees of freedom of the individual and allowing them to be more self-determining is to make structural changes in the society, and absolutely we should be doing that, and we should be making those sorts of criticisms as someone like Bruce Alexander, who I mentioned just in passing, makes when it comes to things like addiction and all sorts of other mental health disorders. But at the same time, a model, we can get into this idea of disruptive pharmacology, but the notion there that she quotes Carhart Harris and the idea of decanalization. We can speak of deterritorialization in the Deleuzean sense, but I mean, it's just a system science way of thinking about things. Of obviously the canalization notion goes to Waddington, so developmental biology notion, but that model, that disruptive model of psychedelic therapy, which can be, scientificized through something like, rebus or the entropic brain, and basically the free energy principle kind of account, the active inference kind of account, or it can be spiritualized, perhaps in a way that Groff and the inner healer are doing. But at this, it's basically just about, can these substances be used to create degrees of freedom that enable the individual to, take advantage of, innate, or, I don't like these terms like intrinsic and things, but capacities for healing that, the nervous system has, or the spirit has, or however you want to frame that. But these are very complementary. So there's a complementary critique of society and a critique of the way that has perhaps contributed to a decrease of degrees of freedom more intrapsychically. And the psychedelic therapy per se, the shamanic type model, the model that's interested in mystical type experiences and those sorts of things, but also the model of decanalization, the neurocognitive description, not just explanation, but description of that kind of dynamic, is about increasing degrees of freedom in the individual pole. And these are surely complementary. Whereas I would say something like microdosing strikes me much more as something that fits really easily into a kind of status quo model of how psychiatry has been used since the Prozac era, and the idea, and we did talk about this in a previous YouTube, I'm now recalling, but the idea of psychoplastogens or neuroplastogens, which are non-psychedelic plasticity enhancers, that kind of thing is again, it might be conceptually flawed to some degree, but psychotropic medications in general, SSRIs, SNRIs, et cetera, do increase neuroplasticity, just not in this big immediate way that the neuroplastogens do. But yeah, the idea of microdosing so that you can juice more out of the working day, that's just caffeine or Ritalin or whatever for a generation that styles themselves as countercultural, but is absolutely completely within the mainstream.
Yeah. No, it's the professional managerial class approach to psychedelics, where it just becomes a means of increasing efficiency and productivity for the same social machine that generates inequality. And so, I guess, there's a way in which this activist approach to psychedelic studies is both serving a valuable role, but also I personally feel more inclined to constructive psychedelic studies because it seems to me that even if, Doblin's evangelizing and outlandish claims are utopian and not to be taken seriously, overall, I feel reasonably sure that PTSD being treated by MDMA and therapy would have been a net gain in terms of more people having access to these treatments, which do seem to work. Of course, there are risks of re-traumatization. There's a risk of sexual misconduct. There's the risk of people, you know, being people. But there's also something like 15 to 20 veterans committing suicide every single day in the United States. I read that stat recently, 15 to 20 every single day. Uh, and so there's a risk of not seeking radical treatments, that are risky. And I think it all comes down to a question of whether we want to give adults a kind of cognitive liberty, a kind of freedom of consciousness to make these decisions. And I know that's complicated when you bring mental illness into the picture because how much responsibility can we give to someone with treatment-resistant PTSD to make a responsible decision about, on the other hand, who else is better positioned to make that decision than them, the one who is suffering, And so it's like, at the end of the day, I really do fall down on like we should do medical research on these things, but we know enough already that we know that the risks are minimal in comparison to many other things that are perfectly legal. And so for me, it's not a medical issue anymore. You know,
Mm.
we want to learn more about medical applications and different treatment protocols and everything. But if we can have cigarettes and tobacco and drive, 3,000 pound uh, vehicles around when we're 21, then we should also be able to purchase these chemicals with a regulated system in place, whether we want to use them recreationally or spiritually, or because, we want to self-medicate. I think as adults, we should have that freedom.
Yeah, I think, even, I mean, I agree. And just full stop. But no drug is made more safe by prohibition in any case. Drugs are made much more dangerous, generally speaking, by prohibition, and not to mention the generation or the creation by prohibitive policies of black markets, which not only can lead to, basically people just don't know what they're getting, which is one way that drugs become much more dangerous, is that you buy a pill on the
Yeah.
street, you don't know what's in it. That's a big issue. It can also lead to the kinds of issues that we see in parts of the world where organized crime, which in the US, some historians at least believe was created by alcohol prohibition. Like alcohol prohibition was the origin of organized crime in the US. But we know there's plenty of organized drug-fueled, drug-financed organized crime around the world. And some of these criminal organizations have better weapons and more money than the governments that they are in some kind of almost open state of war with. And
Yeah.
that is something that's created by drug prohibition. I mean, so the history of drug prohibition in itself, and even the WHO will basically say that this goes back to the opium wars, is itself a fascinating thing to study. So I think
And to be fair, I should just say Nashe Deveneaux and the whole Symposia crew are totally on board with ending drug prohibition and ending the drug war. So they're on board. They agree with us too. I know that.
But I don't think that I think one has to have a realistic. So we can talk all we want about adaptive conflict and how we don't want that to be solely resolved on the side of the individual who has to then just simply acquiesce to the demands of the culture. We want to be able to take a very critical stance towards cultural norms, but we also need to be realistic about the way about the way progress is going to be made through channels which are, canals, there is a canalizing process of the culture and its regulatory mechanisms. And so if we simply flout that altogether and say, well, maybe it would be a good thing if MDMA were available as a treatment, but not in this way. This is too much, or something like. It's like then you're shooting ourselves in the foot there. There's a chance to make progress here, and it's not the one and done kind of progress. We're not getting to where we want things to be in one go. And there are definitely issues. Some of the science may have been shoddy with these Lycos trials. I mean, doesn't make them uniquely different from clinical trials in general. There are often issues, and that doesn't always prevent a substance from being approved. Of course, it was always because of the stigma, because of the because of the prejudices and the history of demonization of these substances, it was always going to be difficult to get this across the line. And I definitely think there's a relevant, as we've discussed, as we've agreed, there's a relevant critique of MAPS and the way and of basically, utopian psychedelic utopianism. That's a relevant critique there, and that's not,
But it
but
seems very unlikely to me that the next corporation
yeah,
that applies for FDA approval of MDMA or some analog that they invent um, is going to be a benefit corporation like
yeah.
Lycos. It's probably going to be just totally for profit.
Well, especially
Maybe,
if it's an analog that they invent. I
yeah,
mean, that's a very key thing here, is that these drugs, here's another barrier to their approval, which is that they are not, generally speaking, patentable, because they're either natural products or generic chemistry, which has been around for a very long time. So novel patents cannot be made. This is why people have separated the racemic mixture of ketamine into its two enantiomers and patented esketamine. Patented one of the enantiomers, which is a bizarre way of getting around these rules. But basically, there isn't a huge incentive. There hasn't been a huge incentive, and quite the opposite, perhaps, for drug companies to bankroll clinical trials of substances of these, basically, again, of natural chemistry, natural products, or like generic medicine, essentially generic chemistry, because it's difficult for them to see a way to make a huge amount of money out of it. And monetizing a kind of protocol of psychedelic assisted therapy is a kind of unknown quantity as well. Like, can we patent, and people try this, right? Can we patent a particular treatment program? And it's like, in a lot of cases, these treatment programs, I mean, they obviously have their roots in the psychedelic studies of the 60s, in many cases 60s through 80s, but also they're really just building on kind of ancient models. This is the way that these substances and altered states in general have been incorporated into various, we might call them anachronistically, mental health modalities, mental health treatments for centuries and thousands of years, and essentially in a way that's ubiquitous across cultures, with different substances involved, different practices involved. So there's a big issue for monetization of these things, and that is arguably one of the barriers to their approval through the medical paradigm. And also, to your point, there are distinct risks associated with medicalization. There are distinct risks associated with recreational use of these substances. And it's always important to say, and I know it's like boring to say this, but, just because they're physiologically pretty safe doesn't mean that they're super safe. Like, there's plenty of opportunity for things to be
no,
seriously.
I
There's a
think
dark.
I know lots of psychedelic casualties,
Yeah.
for sure.
So this is, psychedelic burnout, and, psychedelic, I mean, psychedelic trauma, right? So anxiety disorders that have been, that, people, yes, they may have some propensity, sure, but no matter
It's like,
what, yeah.
yeah, I mean, we go backpacking through the wilderness at great risk to our own uh, physical well-being, because we are creatures who are experience hungry, and we want to grow and develop. And I think that urge and that desire is perfectly natural. But we also have these cultural guardrails, which are predominantly uh, religious historically, but religion and theology in the secular period gets gets secularized in various ways and becomes um, talked about in more scientific language or in more therapeutic language or what have you. But it's still it's this cultural containment system, and psychedelics are uh, ontological disruptors, precisely because uh, they explode all of that, and they are difficult for our existing institutions and cultural belief systems to make sense of. Um, but I think, you know, we're all going to die one day, and these experiences help us confront that fact. I think um, in potentially generative ways that, and it's see another problem with the medicalization approach is that the whole discussion starts to get framed around trauma, either the treatment of it or the risk of causing it as a result of some negative bad trip or whatever. And it's like, you know, that shuts down the conversation about the research potential of this for phenomenology, for neuroscience, for um, individual exploration. I mean, so it's like, yes, it's risky, but on the other hand, we've already been diagnosed with a terminal situation, like just by virtue of by virtue of being born, and it just seems such a curtailment of our curiosity to say, oh, these have to be illegal because they're unsafe, or to say only if the doctor writes you a prescription, or etc. That kind of infantilizing approach to this really annoys me.
Sure.
Um,
And what does it take to justifiably have that kind of authority? And are psychiatrists necessarily the people who should have that kind of authority? Psychiatrists might be well, as MDs, might be reasonably well placed to talk about the physiological risks of certain substances, although I would suggest that they have again, not all psychiatrists, but they haven't necessarily shied away from prescribing drugs which have very significant physiological risks. But ostensibly their training enables them for that. But do they have the kind of, dare I say, spiritual wisdom to be put in that position? And we should probably note that most cultures, maybe all cultures, that have had a kind of structural relationship with this kind of disruptive pharmacology, which is many human cultures, have had authorities within the culture who mediated access to that, either to that substance, but they would probably frame it in a different way, right? To that other realm, to that other world of experience, to those altered states, to the spirit realm, etc. And maybe we should talk about the structural role that kind of other has had in some of these cultures. But they haven't necessarily done away with it. Hasn't necessarily been a free-for-all. Obviously, there have been specific kinds of cultural containers, specific ritual practices, which were usually presided over by adepts of some description. But the question is, within our culture, are psychiatrists the people who are one of the early ways of thinking about psychedelics in the West when they first arrived, into Western psychiatry, broadly speaking, in the 50s, even though really things like mescaline had been around for much longer than that. But when they started gaining momentum with LSD and psilocybin in particular, was this psychotomimetic idea, right? And there's an ambiguity as to whether this is something that patients are going to take, as in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, or whether actually this is for the psychotherapist or the psychiatrist to take to have a relatively safe and temporary access to the kinds of experiences, psychotomimetic and mimesis of a psychotic episode, that their patients were having. And so there's this question, there's all this psychedelic training going on in the world right at the moment. There are psychedelic training courses being offered in Australia, for example. But unlike if you went to the Netherlands and got psychedelic training where you would actually have your own active sessions, here in Australia, that would be completely illegal, right? It's not part of the authorized prescriber program that the prescribing physician actually partakes, becomes experienced in the Jimi Hendrix, are you experienced kind of sense, right? And is this a problem? This is another thing we need to discuss. And so I think, some of what I'm alluding
is the Australian model that the MDMA is prescribed for the client, the patient to take home with them, or they would do it in a clinic with
they
the
would do it in clinic,
therapist?
and
Okay.
that's regulated on a state-by-state basis.
Okay.
So in some states, it has to be basically in a hospital, and in other states, it can be in like just a psychiatrist's clinic, and that's an ongoing area of the development of policy. But no, there's no. It's very clear that there will be no approvals for the unsupervised usage of these substances. Yeah, so it's and it is expected. It's actually on the checklist for the checklist kind of gives you an idea of what you should. It's not necessarily. It says you don't necessarily have to tick all the boxes. These are just guidelines, but the kinds of things that you would expect to be in an application for a treatment protocol that could be approved by a human ethics committee and blah blah blah.
I doubt this will happen with MDMA, but in the States with ketamine, since COVID and telehealth really expanded, you can now get prescribed ketamine lozenges and take them home with you, or have them mailed to you, and do a therapy session on Zoom as you ingest it.
I mean, interesting, right? Because ketamine is safe. This is a difficult thing to say, right? Because it's safe in some respects. It's a pretty safe general anesthetic. But if you are being basically monitored, it's relatively safe. So physiologically, it's quite safe, but it's far less safe than say physiologically than say psilocybin or MDMA to be taking in an unsupervised context. So that, I mean, it is fascinating how, and we all know this, right? Like anyone who's paid any attention, like safety, despite the rhetoric of the different scheduling systems in different parts of the world, safety isn't a primary consideration when it comes to the legal approval of certain substances. I mean, some of the most dangerous things that are used as drugs in Australia, but are, elsewhere in the world as well, are like paint thinners and things that are obviously they're not sold as drugs. They're not, petrol is not intended to be put in a container and sniffed, but when used as a drug, this is amongst the most dangerous things you can do, because there's a possibility for like acute and sudden death, basically, not to mention long-term brain damage as a result from using inhalants in this way. But petrol is still, $2 a liter or whatever, and anyone can buy it, which is just a limit case. Of course, it's not subject to drug regulations at all, but this is because the way we understand any kind of substance in some relational network, so according to its function in our culture, is what determines the way we regulate it. It's not to do with its intrinsic safety or not. I mean, that is a consideration, yes, but it is a minor one in comparison to these other things. And that's why the hidden subtext with the fact that all these disruptive, basically, hallucinogenic slash psychedelic, but hallucinogenic being a broader class of substances, drugs have traditionally in Western cultures and elsewhere kind of subsequently, like following the lead of Western cultures, have been put into the most restricted classes, clearly has absolutely nothing to do with the stated inclusion criteria for those classes, like no medical purpose, no medical application, high potential for abuse and all that. We know very well, I mean, drug scientists know very well that these have low potential for abuse and well-established medical purposes. So that, of course, indicates that there is an unspoken reason, which is more to do with you know power structures, essentially more to do with the structure of our societies and the apparent threat that disruptive pharmacology, which we might say gives access to a perspective from outside the received norms and whatever that we have been interpolated into. So it gives us that perspective from outside. And now these other cultures that we've talked about, and this is why I think a comparative sort of anthropological but not appropriative but anthropological approach to psychedelic studies is really, really warranted here, because it's like, what is the role that kind of access, that those kinds of altered states, which are specifically associated with like ego dissolution or psycholysis, the relaxation of the habitual patterns of thinking and habitual perspectives, which again tend to be the bequest of the culture in which an individual is nested. What has been the structural role of getting outside that and being able to examine that from outside? And again, who's had access to that? Because not necessarily everybody's had access to that in obviously in different cultures. And how has that been mediated and all of that? And those become really interesting questions when we're starting to think about how are we going to, if we are going to, not integrate, because integrate already sounds like we're going to sustain our current cultural paradigms and we're going to somehow integrate psychedelics into them or whatever. But how are we going to create a novel integration, maybe, let's say? But if we're moving to a situation where psychedelics are legal and whatever, and maybe it is the case that capitalism has just taken us and to this point where our norms are kind of so implicit and so relaxed in some way, and we are able to pursue so many different ways of life and all of that, that the impact of disruptive pharmacology is going to be relatively minimized. But there's clearly still a fear that it won't be. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these issues with getting things through these regulatory pipelines, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are definitely these sort of very big stories that are told in an attempt to look at the anthropological history of the interaction between human beings and psychedelic substances. And there's a fascinating sort of countercultural history there that gets played up by major figures in the history of psychedelics, in the 20th century, going back to the mysteries of Eleusis and the indication that there might have been an LSD-like substance in the ergot fungus growing on the wheat when people are being initiated as a result of drinking the so-called kaikyan or soma in the ancient Vedic context. And so every cultures on every continent, have some example of psychedelic experience playing an initiatory role at the core of the kind of cultural and religious belief system and ideological structure around which these civilizations are organized. And in the modern secular Western world, as you were saying earlier, we still have certain drugs which are sanctioned, which alter consciousness quite dramatically. But other drugs, particularly the ones that were so important for these rituals and initiation rites historically, have been suppressed and forbidden despite their relative safety profile. Safety third, really, and when it comes to psychedelics and how they're scheduled. And so bringing these substances back into the cultural conversation and taking them seriously and being willing to look at them without the bias of a kind of, I think it's patriarchy partially. It's this atomization thing where, the only avenues for reintroducing psychedelics so far that have been widely sanctioned would be through the individualized therapy model, which is very much an inheritance of the, Protestant and Catholic priestly confession sort of situation. And whereas most of the indigenous traditions and even in ancient Greece, the use of these substances was a collective right. This was done in groups and ceremony settings, not one-on-one. And so, there are a lot of ways in which I think we are stumbling and fumbling as we try to do this, which is not unexpected. Um, a lot has been repressed by our contemporary civilization, and the way that these substances can open the reducing valve, as it were, and allowing the unconscious to pour back in is, we see it repeatedly in the 60s with the mistakes made by the psychedelic counterculture, and it's kind of starting to happen again now with, getting high on your own supply and becoming a bit too evangelical, as if these were miracle cures, because they've never been miracle cures. They've been ways of helping societies remain in contact with the non-rational side of life and even the magical religious side of life, which, um, one of the things that makes me uncomfortable with, Nishay Devano's article is that the magical religious aspirations of a lot of the people involved in the psychedelic renaissance are just completely rejected instead of recognizing I would say, inevitability of that. Um, that to some degree, yes, you can do psychedelic science from the outside of the experience, modeling the brain and um, testing different treatment modalities and what have you. All that is very important. But when you're in the experience, these magical religious interpretive frames become really not just tempting but unescapable. And so this makes the integration of a scientific medical model and um, the very nature of psychedelic experience quite difficult. It's really hard. Most of the attempts, to bring these two sides together end up force fitting and privileging one side or the other. Someone like Stan Groff, I think, privileges the experience itself in all of its ontological ambiguity. Uh, People like Robin Carhart Harris, I don't think they're overly downplaying the power of the experience, but they're trying to find a more uh, empirically grounded um, model for how the brain might be changed by these experiences, right? And so, um,
hugely important. And I, again, I haven't read that whole Devono paper, but yes, it's wrong to imagine we need to have a complete, mechanistic understanding of the way a substance works in order to have some understanding of its effects, of its potential effectiveness.
never been the case in
Never
psychiatry with
been the
its other
case.
substances. Yeah.
Well, it's not the case with any drug. Okay, so that's an important point to make. Like paracetamol, um, most common, I'm blanking on what you guys call it in the US, you call it something else. Most common, painkiller in the world, essentially. What do you call it in the US? Hang on, I need to look
Not
it up.
sure.
It's acetaminophen, right? Anyway, there are no drugs that we have a full understanding of their mechanistic effects, right? So there are, and any drug that has a profound physiological effect, which maybe mediates. So we might have an understanding of, and we generally don't, but even if we do have an understanding of which receptors or which target molecules it interacts with, and often, molecules are very promiscuous, right? They're very sticky. They stick to lots of different things. So they might have primary sites of action, but they usually have many different secondary sites. But even if they don't, if they have a fairly significant physiological effect, which any, strong medicine of any kind clearly has, they're going to have all kinds of downstream effects because they are basically getting into some cycle, getting into some regulatory flow, and they are shifting it in some fairly profound manner off the rails, for better or worse. And that's going to affect every downstream, regulatory cycle regulatory flow that interacts with that primary target, and that becomes the dark matter of pharmacology. And so there's always that. But having a really good, having a great, a potentially good neurocognitive model that goes some way to describing from that perspective what's going on. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. And it's also a way that these things get integrated. Now we need to be careful again not to hold them, as you were saying, to a standard that we wouldn't hold any other substance to, in terms of what is the degree of mechanistic understanding that we need to have. And of course, nobody in history, and there, as we discussed, there have been many cultures that have used substances of these kinds, in communal, but not necessarily, to be honest, in communal circumstances. Lots of psychoactive, consciousness altering substances are used for all kinds of things, like in ritualized hunting magic or something, like to give you greater perception when you go out into the forest as an individual hunter, and or to give to your dog to increase it. Like there've been, psychedelics, broadly speaking, psychoactive, plant and fungal compounds typically have been used for all kinds of reasons. And sometimes it's an issue to try and bring something, in Cambo, the skin secretions from the frog Philomedusa bicolor are like a classic and interesting recent example of this. It's sometimes an issue to take some kind of traditional medicine or traditional psychoactive substance from a particular culture and then impose this universalist, we use it in a communal psychedelic practice, like impose the ayahuasca model or the iboga model or even the Eleusinian model, if you want, onto some of these substances. Because a lot of other cultures, we have a very rich pharmacopoeia, the modern Western culture, but a lot of other cultures have pretty rich pharmacopoeias as well, and they might have had some substance that they used in this commune, they may or may not have. And there are lots of situations where you have, say, a shaman type figure who is the only one that takes the substance, actually. Like somebody comes and consults with that person. This is a kind of Asclepian model of medicine, So for the Asclepian physicians in ancient Greece, they may or may not have been using drugs, but people would come and consult with them, and then they would go and practice incubation, which is basically what the Eleusinian mysteries might also have been. They would go into sacred spaces, often underground, and go into hypnagogic states and commune with the spirits or the ancestors or beings on the other side that had special insight. And they would gain that insight and then bring it back to the patient and prescribe a course of treatment based on that. And certainly in various cultures, psychedelic type substances have been used in that way as well, whereas it might have only been the initiate themselves, the adept themselves that actually use it. I mean, so that's why this comparative method I feel like is useful, because we can potentially get a lot more fine-grained on all the different ways that these things have been used. But I've totally lost my train of thought on what else I was saying. So back to you.
Well, I mean, just in terms of one of the causal mechanisms which has been proposed, by Carhart Harris and Kristen in their Rebus relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model. I think it's a very fruitful way of understanding a sort of mind-brain interface in this case, in that the so-called default mode network kind of goes offline, and it's one of the implications here is that the sort of sense-bound ego that modern Western culture encourages us to identify with is a kind of that brain module, if you want, is a kind of threat detection mechanism, and it comes online when we feel like we need to be in competition with other threat detection modules in other people in our environment, and that this maybe became an emergent function in the brain at some point in our history as social creatures, as the size of our the groups that we lived within got bigger and bigger, and we started to develop more and more of a narrative sense of identity as our language, symbolic language mediated interactions with people, and that we exist in a society that's so large that we don't even get to see most of the people that we're entering into these long distance agreements with. And that, this has over centuries and millennia created a situation where our mental health is just by default pretty sick, in the sense that this ego complex is, you could say it's the developmental stage, because you have to reach a point of a stable amount of anxiety, um, and you're not too psychotic, seeing patterns everywhere, and you're not too anxious, and that you can't even engage socially, and you're not too depressed so that you don't see patterns at all. But it's a stable situation of illness, really. And that psychedelic treatments can help us um, massage this knot. But the thing is, given how complex our civilization is, we can't simply expect that uh, this sort of naive ego dissolution and let's just get rid of the default mode network. Let's just show the ego the door, that somehow our society is going to magically work better, and all of our problems will be solved. And so there's a naive psychedelic evangelism that follows from the idea that all we need to do is switch off the default mode network. On the other hand, being able to um, turn this network on and off rather reliably with these chemicals and the right set and setting does give us the opportunity to experiment um, with alternatives. But so much of the cultural and scientific and perhaps spiritual uh, doors that would be open, by a renewed engagement, um, a widespread engagement with psychedelics, has to do with what we do after the experience to integrate it, more so than just um, what the experience itself delivers, or what the chemical change in our brain might deliver. And I think that's where the real interesting work is. And it's like, how do we build a psychedelically informed, initiated culture, where, yeah, the experience itself is part of how we remind ourselves of that, but that it is not considered to be the end, but rather the means to um, a new way of, integrating uh, the human condition, and integrating um, the profound mystery of existing at all. Um, and so, again, it's a matter of whether uh, the mental health frame is big enough, really, to encompass the implications of the psychedelic experience. Uh, I mean, obviously, it's not, and yet um, there are still ways in which, for the average person, I think mental health and health in general, is more than just a material thing. I mean, we're really talking about spiritual health. There's an element to mental health that is about meaning and purpose and feeling connected.
Psychic health, right? Psychology, yeah, which is
Yeah,
what mental health, right? The health of the soul. Um, Etymologically, so structurally speaking, that's what we're talking about. And that's a reason not to conflate, not to say mental health disorders are brain diseases, because even though there are obviously neural correlates to any sort of mental health disturbance, unless we are, full on dualists, that's going to be the
yeah,
case.
yeah.
But
So, yeah,
the
mental
mental,
illness is, yeah, it's social,
yeah,
it's material, it's ecological, it's transpersonal, right? There are all these dimensions to it, and I think it's my concern is that we, in our rush to be, there's a sense in which I share the critical perspective of the symposia crew against the medical model, and the really the corporate pharmaceutical model, um, but I also am critical of the more or less materialist orientation that they're bringing to the question, because there's no neutral territory for me here. No one is standing on metaphysically neutral ground, as it were, when it comes to trying to interpret these experiences. And we can't simply say, well, let's wait for the science to explain the mechanism, because that's just not really on the table for any psychiatric or pharmaceutical intervention, as you were saying. And so I challenge that claim to ontological uh, neutrality, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can even entertain the idea of neutral language. Um, if we say molecule, if we refer to these things as molecules, well, okay, that's neutral, but it tells us absolutely nothing about what they do. If we refer to them as drugs, we're already on non-neutral territory. If we refer to it as medicine, we're on non-neutral territory. If we refer to it as teachers, we're on non-neutral territory. If we talk about toxins, all of the words we have available to us are going to be ways of framing these substances, or indeed any bioactive molecule, which again is a relatively, is about as neutral as it gets, to refer to it in that way. But as soon as you take even the smallest step beyond that, you're in some kind of non-neutral framing. And, that's unavoidable. And we should just be aware that that's what's happening. And, just an analysis of the way the word drug is used in different contexts in our culture is a really useful thing to do, because it shows how radically non-neutral that term is, even though pharmacologists per se have tried to make it a neutral term, but it will never be a neutral term.
yeah, non-specific amplifier is pretty good. That's Stan Groff's word.
Yeah. That's an interesting one, but amplifier in itself is clearly not a neutral term, because it's going to be increasing something as opposed to decreasing it or whatever. But yeah, that's approaching a more neutral way of putting it, and maybe differentiating these sorts of substances from, say, like a classic depressant, which we might not think of as an amplifier. But those of us who take depressants, which is most people in Western culture, alcohol being an obvious, the obvious one, recognize that in small doses, by suppressing certain pathways, alcohol. Are you reaching for your drink? I thought you were reaching for your drink.
I'm all out of coffee.
Oh, it's coffee. It's coffee. Okay. You had
Oh, you thought I was? Yeah, I did have a gin and tonic last time, but
but
going for
anyway,
the stimulant
we
this
know
time.
that, yeah, well, we know that small amounts of a soporific depressant drug can actually be amplificatory themselves, right? So even these characterizations are not only non-neutral but often kind of misleading. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that you said there, speaking about the self or the ego and the default mode network. I mean, I think there was an early narrative, partly coming out of the Carhart-Harris studies and other things, that, what's going on here is that the default network is being switched off. Like, that's been heavily criticized from the neuropsychological, neurocognitive side of things as well, because you find in some situations there's actually an amplification of of default mode network activity. And I think, one of the things that I think we should avoid, like if we're speaking about a medication or substances, substance, we try to make
No,
that.
as a process philosopher, I do often default to the term substance for psychedelics. So
Yeah, which is
it's weird.
interesting, right? I mean, so substance is a non-neutral term in metaphysics. It seems like a relatively neutral term in when we're speaking about, bioactive molecules. But again, of course, it does get used in very non-neutral ways, as in like substance abuse and all of that. But yeah, I mean, I think if we're thinking about these as disruptive pharmacology, which again is the frame that we've touched on a couple of times, that I like to use here, we should then avoid sort of projecting any kind of universalist frame onto them, and a kind of universalist frame onto the experience itself. You did mention also a kind of inevitability of the spiritual or even kind of religious content the experience itself. But I think what's really going on is that it's just making available a lot of different experiences in some sense, and those religious and spiritual, well, we've all grown up in cultures. So again, we have received from our cultures a set of norms in the sort of spiritual religious space. And those have actually been, even though this might be implicit, or we haven't necessarily been explicitly or consciously thinking about it in these ways, those have been the ways that altered or non-ordinary states of consciousness have traditionally been framed in the culture that we are part of, and maybe in most cultures, right? And so I think that it's naturally the case that even if one is not again, consciously, explicitly self-identifying as a religious or spiritual person, that one will encounter the possibility of, framing, such an experience through those sorts of lenses. And I don't mean that like after the fact, that that's a big part of it. We assimilate experiences of non-ordinary consciousness to adjacent norms, and a lot of those adjacent norms happen to be spiritual and religious, right? Or increasingly, some of these, scientific attempts to maybe supplant those things, which again is a kind of category error because they're just on different axes, so to speak. But even during the experience itself, a lot of that exposure that we've had to spiritual and religious norms throughout our life becomes available to our psyche as a way of sort of framing a novel experience that we're having. And I think what's overwhelming then is the kind of the novelty itself, right? That we're having some non-ordinary. It's just not within our range of normal experience for us, unless perhaps we happen to be very well-practiced meditators and what have you. But I will say for myself, if I'm being out in nature and I'm tapping into a kind of experiential landscape that I have spent a lot of time in, meditating, doing open monitoring, and just being a naturalist as a kid, like growing up, like just listening to birds and trying to work out what birds were making those sounds, or what they might be communicating to each other, or looking very closely at signs in my environment to try and track down animals that I was interested in finding or whatever. Like that's a mode that I find is very readily accessed by the kinds of opening that one has with some of these sort of disruptive pharmacology. And that doesn't necessarily have to be, and I'm not against, to be clear, and I've had very experiences that for me were very spiritual and were readily framed in a sort of more religious manner. But I'm just saying that that's not necessarily inevitable in some sense, like it may or may not be there. But I think, there is a lot of relatively I think this is the point you were making, aside from the default mode network thing, kind of unsophisticated discussion of the ego, and how all we need to do is like transcend the ego and dissolve the ego, and not recognizing that the ego is just a function that kind of maintains a certain degree of psychological integrity or coherence, that partly just enables us to meet the world as a kind of stipulatively, I would say, but unified entity. There again, and there are really important reasons to want to perturb that, like to not treat that as some kind of essential unity, like even intrapsychically. Again, you can go Jungian, or really in any of the, a kind of more standard sort of quasi-shamanic approach to the psyche. There are lots of entities, there are lots of complexes in there, and the ego itself is not a unified single thing. Our persona is different in different contexts and under the influence of different drives and impulses and whatever, and we maintain this illusion that it's the same thing. It's not the same thing in terms of its contents from moment to moment, or but certain things are more stable than others in terms of the contents, but it has a kind of function which enables us to meet the world in a certain way, which is very important perhaps for just social mediation and stuff. And so I think to kind of characterize that as intrinsically pathological is problematic. Like as a certain kind of clinging to it that might be pathological. That's a form of addiction, right? So addiction to
Mhm.
identity, like I am this, and anything that tries to tell me I'm not that is a big problem, or whatever. Or again, engaging the threat mode, like my ego is being threatened by something that's coming at me. That can be very pathological. And I think a lot of mental health issues are can be conceptualized in terms of perturbations of the ego function, for
Mm.
sure.
I
Like,
think, I had in mind just a comment that Schelling makes in his ideas for philosophy of nature about mere reflection as a spiritual sickness, and that it severs mind from sensory experience, let's say, or the understanding and its reflection on concepts from our embodied experience of sights and sounds and tastes and so on. um, and that if we're unable to recognize that reflective ego that feels alienated from the body and from the natural world, that's a move that we've made intrapsychically, as it were, and that can be unmade, and we can return to a kind of unity. And there's a narcissistic resubmergence. This is kind of like Ken Wilber's pre-trans fallacy, as he named it later. It's already being articulated by the German idealists, I think. You can return to an undifferentiated state of unconsciousness, or you can move forward into this kind of transpersonal um, mode of development. And I think the ego consciousness, when we have a psychiatry or a psychology that's only geared towards um, allowing the individual to maintain uh, a more or less functional existence in society, um, that's an arrested development for humanity, basically. And psychedelics push the envelope. They push us beyond that in some ways. And so it's not that the ego, I should rephrase and not say that the ego itself is a kind of mental illness, but rather, uh, if we become arrested at that stage of development, it can become a sort of spiritual sickness. And in the course of a human life, it's very important to forge a sense of ego identity, and the self-esteem that comes with it, and the ability to know one's role in different social situations by internalizing some sense of um, your own persona, and how we're really in some sense responsible. Our personas are in some sense a sense of responsibility we have to one another to remain consistent, and our commitments to one another and all of these things. And so it's not that it's just a mental illness, but it needs to be transcended, included and transcended. And I think transpersonal psychology in its various forms is an effort to do that. And psychedelics prove to be, as I've called them, in a very non-neutral sense, in one of my articles on the subject, alchemical catalysts,
yeah, yeah.
Um,
No,
and in
I like that framing a lot, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I think the fundamental pathology, a way of conceptualizing, I always want to soften these things and not say that this is the way to
Mhm.
think about it. But is I mean, this is going to sound a little bit Buddhist, but is grasping, is addiction basically. And that's also just a psychoanalytic way of thinking about it. It's that, and this also ties in both a in like a political, but also in a ontological manner with reification and things like that, because hypostasization, these things that we as sort of process thinkers consider to be very problematic in metaphysics, in an ontological context, are forms of grasping or addiction. They are confusing some kind of, basically a construct. And again, we want to have a nuanced relationship with construction in a process philosophy. Like, constructs can be very real and very enduring, but it's to confuse them with essences or something timeless and just quote unquote natural, or natural with a capital N, like just this is the way it is that things are. Whereas recognizing, yes, that the ego is an operational thing. It's an operational process. It's a way of organizing information, or perspectives on the self, which has this function, this social function, that's quite different from sort of grasping it and becoming like addicted to a particular arrangement of it. And many different mental health disorders can be conceptualized in terms of relationship to some particular ego or identity content, and one's inability to differentiate between that and something that basically is like permanent bedrock reality. And that can be everything from PTSD to sort of narcissistic personality disorders and depression and very obviously addiction, in the more narrow sense now, and the role that identification itself has in the perpetuation of addiction. And there's the whole potential critique of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous in there, which again is not to say that those are not effective. Those have effective aspects to them, like the surrender can be very important. The finding of community amongst people who also identify in that way. But for some people, that identification itself, that I so and so am an addict, is going to be a problem, is going to form part of the circumstances which make it difficult to move beyond addiction for some people. But that could be well compensated by the rewards that you can have for publicly identifying as that, because then you seem to be taking responsibility. And that can also be really important. These things are complex and nuanced. But yeah, I think, again, that's the need for psychedelic studies or whatever, because there are a lot of different perspectives on these things. And what we don't want to see, because it's anti-psychedelic, basically, is a kind of convergence on a set of norms there. And that's what we do see too much of. That's what we saw too much of perhaps in the 60s. Maybe we see too much of that in the New Age community. We see too much of that in the, what does Nesha Deveneaux call it, the Tescrial, group of thought. This psychedelic utopianism, again, there is a problem with a convergence on a particular kind of normative way of framing psychedelics, when again, what seems to be really fundamental, if we can say anything about it, is this disruptive capacity, this capacity that they have to disrupt norms, that they have to enable us to just, so the ego just happens to be a set of norms about the relationship that one has to oneself. So these reflective norms that one again uses to mediate one's social encounters, etc. And being able to step outside that is being able to recognize its contingency, being able to recognize that it is just, which is a word I use way too often because, again, we don't want to trivialize it, but it is a construct, it is contingent, and it is subject to revision, ongoing revision. And in fact, it's being revised on many levels all the time. But we have to actually put in a kind of pressure and exert a kind of force to maintain it, despite all of the varied life experiences that we have to exert a kind of force and expend energy in maintaining it in a certain way. And the inner healer idea basically is about stop exerting that kind of force, right? Enable the thing to be reconstituted by experience, and having a very intense experience of the kind that psychedelics can, give ready access to, potentially enables that reconstitution to happen in a very dynamic way. And the neurological description, the plastogenic description, is a beautiful correlate for that. But there might be something to be said about people going too many times to the well. Like, can you dilute? If an experience is on some level all about the novel perspective that it can generate, if taking a substance is all about that, well, if you do it all the time, are you going to just be creating a new, or you do it too regularly, are you going to be creating a new status quo? Is that itself a possibility? And if you have a set of norms that have basically been tailored to describing that kind of experience, that may be imprisoning yourself.
Like how Alan Watts put it. I don't know if he wrote this in Joyous Cosmology or if he just said it in a radio interview or something, but he said, when you get the message, hang up the phone.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's
you have to do the work then, right? Then you have to do this integration that you've mentioned. And I think integration, again, it's like sustainability. It's a sort of a word that can have positive and negative ways of framing it. But yeah, there's a kind of quasi addiction to psychedelics, I would suggest, which is wanting to go back and get that novel experience again, because there's some thrill associated with having that novel perspective. And again, I'm not saying don't go back at all or whatever. It can be good to have a reminder. But if you're finding that you need to keep going back because your daily life has become, gray on gray, and you need that colorful perspective that psychedelics gives you, there might be an issue there too. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's some degree to which one would hope that, I mean, the ideal here would be that the insights that are gained in these altered states can then become, uh, once you return to your normal state of consciousness, that they can function as lures. Like, what's possible now. You've experienced this state, and they can become lures toward new stages of psychological development. Um, but there's a degree to which, placebo is very important here, and expectancy is actually very important here, which part of the whole set and setting um,
Mm.
that factors into the nature of that the psychedelic experience ends up taking. Uh, if one enters the experience with faith in an inner healing intelligence, my guess is, and maybe there is some research on this, maybe a little bit, I think, actually, but more research would need to be done. But my guess is that uh, this set that one goes into the experience with would lead to better clinical results in terms of how people subjectively report uh, having been transformed afterwards. And we know already that, it's pretty well established that in psilocybin studies, the intensity of the mystical experience reported by the mysticism scale does positively correlate with the subjective benefit, both reported by the participant, but also by a designated community member who, confirms that, yeah, they do seem happier and kinder. And so that means that faith, and I'm using that word advisedly, as a placebo is a very important uh, factor in determining the clinical outcome, right? And so that's a sticky issue that I think is not one that the psychiatric medical establishment is well equipped to handle. Um,
Yeah, I agree, but I totally agree, and I think that that's just a more general. Again, this is just something that psychedelics. I mean, of course, the placebo effect is just something that psychedelics, in this context, are drawing more attention to. But in just mental health in general, we could do an exercise where if I spend a lot of time cultivating a positive self narrative, and also one that encourages, I'm encouraging myself to spend more time with my daughter and my wife and to be more open and generous and stuff, how will that affect my mental health? Whereas if I do the opposite and intentionally cultivate a self narrative or a narrative about the relationship between self and the world, like everybody's against me, this is really awful, I'm shit, all of it, how's that going to affect my mental health? Like the way we think about stuff. So we can talk about faith, we can say having faith in oneself, having faith in the spiritual healer, having faith in the inner healer is going to have an effect for sure, because it's just like the kinds of self narratives that you cultivate, the the way you think about stuff affects your health. And that's something that, yes, a sort of modern mechanistic scientific paradigm may have some difficulty dealing with, but I don't think anybody seriously doubts that. I don't think anybody seriously doubts that the way we think has an effect on our health. I think this is just common sense. And I mean, okay, we should problematize common sense, but without being silly about it. It matters how you conceive of yourself and others for your mental
right.
health, your
But
behavior.
sort of the Food and Drug Administration's framework for evaluating the efficacy of MDMA treatment for PTSD is always based on the the causal mechanism here is a shift in the chemistry of the brain. And so they want to eliminate the factor of people coming to the study either already having done MDMA or heard a bunch about how MDMA really works well, and oh, there's this inner healer that I can activate by taking this. That to them is counts as confounding any evidence they might find for it working, even if it's part of the mechanism of action.
They worry about standardization when it comes to the psychotherapeutic part of the intervention. And there's also a bunch of work showing that, beyond like, school of psychotherapeutic thought, beyond a psychotherapist training, just the individual psychotherapist has a more powerful effect even than say SSRIs and things like that. The right, like a good psychotherapist, good in terms of the measures of these studies, psychotherapists plus without SSRIs can have a stronger positive effect than a poorly performing psychotherapist plus the drug aid. And there's just no way of getting around that. But it is basically what we're saying here is that the FDA, and this goes back to our ontological critique and really our broader project, which is a related topic too, has a deterministic model of drug effects. And the thing is, and here I speak as a kind of quasi-drug scientist, I'm a toxinologist who teaches pharmacology, but toxinology you can look at it either as toxinology enveloping pharmacology, or really I look at it as chemical ecology as enveloping pharmacology, like pharmacology is part of the chemical ecology of the human, as I say. But anyway, that might just be me trying to appeal to some kind of disciplinary authority that I have. But I can say with pretty strong confidence that there is no such thing as a context independent effect of a bioactive molecule, right? And this is just very, very basic. It's basic chemistry, but it's certainly basic chemical ecology. So that's everything from, some molecules are toxic to some organisms and not others. There's lots of toxin resistance in the world. There are dose-dependent effects. There are all kinds of effects of basic baseline physiology. Another critique that the FDA seemed to have was that the Lycos crew didn't look at any baseline, heart health and liver health. So they hadn't really checked the baseline health and any potential changes in that, which is probably a fairly significant omission, to be honest. They probably should have done that. But I mean, that's normally part of a phase one clinical trial where it's.
And I'm sure there's other studies on the toxicity of MDMA that are out there.
There are for sure, and I'm sure the Lycos study design probably appealed to that. But I gather that's one of the criticisms that they had. But anyway, there's simply no such thing as a context-independent effect of any drug or any bioactive molecule. And that is something we can make very, very rigorous. And that has nothing to do with, set and setting in the sort of Timothy Leary sense. However, that is itself a manifestation or a particular form of context. So the sociocultural context, which includes the set of beliefs, therefore the expectancy that people have about the effectiveness of a certain thing, and especially if it's a kind of experiential medicine, that's obviously going to shape their experience. If you go in really terrified that you're going to have a very bad experience, that might actually increase the chances of you having a bad experience, right? That just seems kind of obvious. So the linguistic, the sociocultural context, that kind of framing is just another, from the perspective of chemical ecology, to me, that's just another kind of inframing context. And the idea, like, you have to be a dualist to not think that it is, basically. To be thinking that thoughts are free floating from the body so that they're not having any impact on physiology, basically, is just a completely untenable point of view.
Yeah. Well, I think we better move towards wrapping this up, but I think, it seems to me that one of the preconditions for the efficacy of psychedelic therapy is going to be this trust in the unconscious, right? Or trust in the pre-individual potential, that, the psyche can be profoundly disrupted and shaken out of its normal grooves of operation and have its normal defense mechanisms sort of dissolved. And that trust that you come into the experience with, or faith, if use the more provocative term, is part of what allows the alchemical process, which is initiated by these substances to move towards wholeness, and if you lack that framing, um, particularly if you come into it with anxiety, and if someone who's familiar, say, with the literature from the 50s about psychomimetic accounts of what these things are doing, it's going to have a very different experience probably than someone who's just read William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. um, and so that makes this such a delicate and um, I think really fascinating area of inquiry and intercultural intervention, um, as well as obviously individual psychological transformation. And for me, the basic question here is like, is it safe? And you can ask that in just the most existential sense about human life, and the answer is, well, no, it's not safe. Um, but on the other hand, if you have this deeper sense of transpersonal trust, let's call it, I think when you are granted the opportunity to engage with these um, pharmacological disruptors and consciousness disruptors, um, I think you're more likely to discover ways to answer that question positively. That, oh no, actually, this is safe. I'm gonna die, uh, but it's still safe. You know, um, it's still worth being alive. And I think, as many sources of trauma and inequality and suffering and mental illness as there are today, one of the major sources of mental illness and ultimately physiological illness is stemming from this meaning crisis, uh, because we have so many ways to become distracted from what really matters. And psychedelics are risky precisely because they often don't allow us to look away um, from those things that uh, uh, poke at us from the edges of our consciousness. Um, we're able to look at them, and yeah, maybe if the experience isn't well held and done in the proper setting, we may be more deeply traumatized than when we started. But if the conditions are um, responsibly constructed and you've got good people around you, I think uh, the evidence, as far as I can read it, suggests that this would be reintegrating these experiences would be a net positive for our culture. So
Yeah, and I think that's really well said. And I think the faith here is kind of just faith in reintegration, faith in reconstitution. So if you're going to undergo an experience of, ego disintegration, dissolution, you're going to, this is the way it would be framed, and perhaps traditionally has been framed as a kind of katabatic experience. You're going to let the ego die. You're going to go to the underworld. Maybe why the Greeks did a lot of these things underground. And why a lot of their sages were depicted as having these experiences of crossing to Hades and coming back. But again, that's just a perennial shamanic theme, right? But if you're going to let go of the world of normal waking consciousness, which we could say we do every night, but bracketing that, the ego is going to undergo a kind of experiential death. Like you want to have faith that you're going to come back. You want to have faith that in the inner healer that's going to reconstitute, yes, you're going to be something, it's going to be the other side of a transformative experience. And so by definition, you can't know what that's going to look like, but you want to have faith that it's going to be something that you can bear, something that is going to be maybe healthier or whatever. Because yeah, I mean, perhaps a major source of really negative experiences on psychedelics is precisely that lack of that faith, because it's the grasping. If the grasping of the ego function, but just in general, is this fundamental pathology, when the thing starts coming on and the fingers, metaphorically start being peeled back from the thing they're grasping tighter and tighter, is just creating a physiological stress response in the body, and that can lead to a very negative, a very fear-based experience. You're fearing this disintegration, you're fearing this loss of ego function, because why? Because I guess you're afraid that it's not going to be reintegrated. And I mean, that's a very relatable fear. Like, it's a very normal fear to have. But like you're saying, in a sense, the antidote to that fear is exactly this kind of faith that you're talking about. And kind of that, you can frame it in really prosaic terms. I think, it's like egoing, selfing is just a normal thing that your nervous system does. And it will, once the influence of this ego busting chemistry has passed, it'll go back to doing that relatively normal thing. But perhaps your interest in psychedelics, whoever you are, you hypothetical person undergoing this experience, is predicated on some kind of, maybe it's tacit, but understanding that too much of this selfing, this unrelenting process of selfing, is the problem itself. So you're looking for those degrees of freedom, but the habit is so strong, it's such a normal thing for your psyche to do and for your neurophysiology to do, that it's going to just do it again once, because people are afraid also, right, that they're going to go mad, right, that they won't come back from an experience of this kind. And again, that's a very normal fear to have, but the antidote to that does seem to be this kind of faith that you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, we covered a lot of ground here. Got a little FEP discourse in there for a second. And yeah, we'll see what happens next, whether Lykos is able to do another phase 3 trial, or whether some other pharma company comes onto the scene. Ketamine will continue to be prescribed, and lots of clinics are opening up everywhere. There's, a push for psilocybin. I think LSD is not moving forward as quickly, just because it's more expensive to sit with somebody for 12 hours. But I don't think the psychedelic renaissance is dead yet. It's just a very interesting, dam has been erected where we thought the river was already halfway to the ocean and unstoppable. And so how that stream gets diverted is anybody's guess at this point.
Yeah, I don't, I can't obviously speak so intimately to the American situation, and obviously you've got a certain kind of closeness to this because of the degree of involvement that CIIS has had and all of that. But I can't see it being a major. I mean, it's a major decision, but I don't think it's a major setback to the quote unquote psychedelic renaissance. And I do think, part of the discourse has been, again, I think there are lots of different ways to respond to an event of this kind. And I've seen lots of, interesting, but sometimes, contradictory responses. This could be a good thing in a certain sense, right? In that there may be legitimate criticisms to be made of maps. Certainly, we've talked about psychedelic utopianism. I do think that's a legitimate criticism. Again, if your whole community has been stigmatized since the 60s for being cultic and, utopian, don't act that out in a hugely public way as though, that's one thing. But there may have been, I mean, there are obvious challenges, and hopefully the FDA will continue to provide, or will provide, even more clarity about how those challenges should be met. But many of the challenges that apparently have been raised with functional unblinding and the standardization of the psychotherapeutic component and those sorts of things, those are going to be ongoing challenges. But recognizing that those are going to be ongoing challenges, and therefore coming up with strategies to meet them, is a very important part of moving the medicalization of that particular aspect of this movement forward. So it's a negative result, but maybe there is some progress still being made there.
Lessons learned, hopefully. Yeah. All right, Tim. Fun chat.
And
Um, let's do purse next time. Yeah.
first, yeah. Hopefully, I'll
Awesome.
be less congested and more, you know, functional cognitively. But yeah, let's do a guess at the riddle and talk about firstness, secondness, and thirdness, and sort of minimal schemes in metaphysics and all of that. I think that'd be fun.
Great. Yeah. Can't wait. I've been enjoying reading that essay and thinking convergent concepts that are articulated using different language, but
Yeah,
obviously so much resonance with Whitehead and some of the other thinkers that we've been thinking with. So yeah, I look forward to spending some time with Perse.
wonderful.
Hope the recovery continues apace and you don't catch some new bug from the daycare.
Oh, that'd be good. Good to have a bit of respite. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks,
All
man.
right. Enjoy your Friday. Talk
Hey,
to you soon.